Welcome to Only in America. I'm Ali Nurani. This week, we focus on a country which imprisons migrants fleeing violence and then separates them from their children.
We've got to get this message out. You're not given immunity. You will be prosecuted if you come illegally, and if you bring children, you'll still be prosecuted.
And when an elected senator arrives to check on the welfare of those children, he's denied entry.
I've now been asked to leave the property. As far as we know, no member of Congress has been allowed to actually see what's going on with this program.
In my conversation with two leaders in the evangelical community who are helping Christians across the country grapple with immigration.
We've always had this conversation around whether we should welcome them or not, but I think most people acknowledge that they've strengthened our country. And to see that so much of the conversation was so ugly at times and dehumanizing, especially for that rhetoric coming from people of faith, I think really troubled me.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Nurani with Only in America. Yes, that country is my country, the United States of America. And that was U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and the senator was Democrat Jeff Merkley from Oregon. Senator Merkley was trying to see what was happening to children caught up in the Trump administration's new zero-tolerance policy of criminally prosecuting parents who present themselves and their children at the U.S.-Mexico border. Let me take a quick step back and explain. In early May, Attorney General Sessions announced that the U.S. will prosecute 100% of illegal southwest border crossings. He added that people who were, quote, smuggling a child will be prosecuted, and that child will be separated from their parent, quote, as required by law. Let me be clear, this is not required by law. It is a new policy put forward by the Trump administration. And in practice, this means that even parents fleeing violence to protect their young children will be deemed smugglers, that is, criminals. And once a parent is put into criminal proceedings, their child is removed from them and detained in a facility like the one Senator Merkley was trying to visit. Here's how his visit played out.
So I'm standing here in front of Southwest Key Program's Casa Padre, and this is a former Walmart that has been turned into a center for children. So behind those doors inside that Walmart are apparently many hundreds of children. I don't know how many, but why are they there? Okay, we're going to wrap up this as we walk off the property here. And I've now been asked to leave the property, and so I'll comply with that. I was excited for a moment that the young lady on the telephone said, yes, the supervisor would be happy to come out and talk to me. Supervisor did come out. Unfortunately, when the supervisor came out, he didn't want to hold a conversation. Since this new policy of children being ripped out of their parents' arms, while people are awaiting adjudication for asylum because of the tragic circumstances they've gone through abroad. So far as we know, no member of Congress has been allowed to actually see what's going on with this program.
Writing for The Intercept, Debbie Nathan spent time in the Brownsville, Texas courtroom of Judge Ronald Morgan. In stark terms, Nathan lays out the real-life consequences of this new zero-tolerance policy. And while the article is an absolute must-read, the audio Nathan captured from the courthouse will just rattle your nerves.
Ms. Diaz-Castro, anything you'd like to say before sentence?
El mismo caso de ellos que mi hija, solo que a ella no me la han separado, pero me dijeron que sí me la iban a quitar.
The same case as theirs. Only they haven't separated me from my daughter, but they told me they were going to take her away.
Well, let's hope they don't. You and your daughter should be joined together. Ms. Gander, my understanding is that where there is parent and child, the parent and child are supposed to be joined before they are separated and sent home. Is that correct?
That's what I heard, Your Honor, as well.
Tell you what, if it's not, then a lot of folks have some answering to do. Because what you've done, in effect, by separating these children, is you're putting them someplace without their parent. You can imagine there's a hell, and that's probably what it looks like. You best confirm that's the case. You best make sure that's the case.
Yes, Your Honor.
Have a seat. Okay. Ms. Amaya Lopez, I think he was the same before sentence.
No.
Mr. Garcia, being anything was the same before sentence.
No.
Mr. Sonia Vasquez, anything was the same before sentence.
No.
Mr. Hidalgo Gomez.
Every day, there are more reports of children being separated from their parents. Parents unable to find their children. The Trump administration believes they are deterring future migrants from making the journey and that they are protecting children from human trafficking. Instead, as a nation, we are criminalizing parents' love for their children. Most Americans want to see enforcement of a strong border along with a compassionate approach to treating others. They want to see dreamers protected, our ports of entry secured, and new businesses launched by hardworking immigrants. Very few Americans want to see children put into massive detention facilities, callously separated from their mothers and fathers. We want to live in an America that is a nation of laws and a nation of grace. An America that believes the family is a sacred unit. Migrants do not flee violence and murder with malice in their hearts. They come to the U.S. because our nation offers them a chance for a better future. Let's hope that never changes. I'm Ali Nirani. After the break, unifying the evangelical movement over immigration. Two guests from World Relief speak of their optimism.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the James Irvine Foundation, expanding opportunity for the people of California, and from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, established in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding.
I'm Ali Nirani, and this is Only in America, which comes to you each week from the National Immigration Forum. Subscribe to our podcast on our website, immigrationforum.org, or via your favorite podcast platform. And if you're on iTunes, do me a solid. Please write a review of the show. Almost 10 years ago, Matt Soerens and Jenny Yang wrote the first edition of Welcoming the Stranger, Justice, Compassion, and Truth in the Immigration Debate. I've learned a lot from that book. I've learned a lot from Matt and Jenny. They are two of the smartest, most compassionate, most articulate advocates I've ever worked with. And Jenny and Matt, they're just awfully nice and fun people. They both work for World Relief, which empowers local churches across America to work for the most vulnerable in our society. And they just released a second edition of Welcoming the Stranger. In our conversation, Jenny and Matt explain how the task of unifying evangelical Christians seems daunting amid the rhetoric of the Trump administration.
I think it really startled me because I realized how much of a disconnect there was between people of faith and also this issue as a policy issue. And in my personal experience, I, of course, know how much immigrants contribute to this country, how much value they add to our communities. And I mean, that's who we are as a country. Or, I mean, we've always had this dichotomy of, not dichotomy, but we've always had this conversation around whether we should welcome them or not. But I think most people acknowledge that they've strengthened our country. And to see that so much of the conversation was so ugly at times and dehumanizing, especially for that rhetoric coming from people of faith, I think really troubled me. And so it really became a passion of mine over the past decade or so to really start to change that narrative.
You know, in some ways, my story of engaging this topic is similar to Jenny's in that it maybe started outside the United States. Or at least one of the key moments for me was I spent a summer as a college student in Costa Rica, and some of the Nicaraguan immigrant families that I was working with became really good friends. And I pretty quickly noticed that they faced a fair amount of opposition and kind of ugly rhetoric among some people in Costa Rica. And I remember asking one of them at one point, so, you know, why would you come here? Like, you get treated really badly and you work really hard and no one seems to appreciate you. Why come here? And one of them told me, you know, Mateo, here we've got food on our plates and a little bit of extra money to send back to support our elderly parents in Nicaragua. And that's all we can ask for. And it really stuck with me. It made me upset. But then I realized as I came back to suburban Chicagoland that there was a bunch of immigrants here, and I didn't actually know any of them. And I probably believed some things about them, like some of the rhetoric I'd heard about Nicaraguans in Costa Rica, either that they're lazy or they're stealing our jobs, which, how do those go together? Or, they're criminals or they bring diseases, all that sort of rhetoric. And that really launched me into wanting to understand this issue a lot better. And ultimately, I moved into a neighborhood where most of my neighbors have been immigrants of one sort or another. And it's really transformed my life. And then I'm, like Jenny, really passionate about seeing the evangelical church tradition that I'm a part of embrace immigrants the way that I think that Scripture calls us to.
As you wrote this second edition, what did you feel like was the big change as you were going through it? Were there things that had become better or worse?
I think on a couple of fronts, I think there's obviously been a lot of changes on the political front with dehumanizing language around the immigrants becoming almost a norm or somewhat socially accepted now. But I also think that there's been significant changes within the church, especially church leaders and pastors who are really engaging on this issue from a theological perspective and a ministry opportunity. I think especially with the book that came out 9 years ago, a lot of church leaders have used it as a tool to start conversations in churches around a biblical perspective around the issue of immigration. And so I think we've been really encouraged by that. And so the book does incorporate a lot of information about what we're seeing as kind of a renewed commitment, I think, within the church.
And then, Matt, from your perspective, as you've been traveling in the country, working with pastors, what are the changes you've seen in between the first and second edition?
What's been odd to me is we've actually seen a significant improvement from my view of how evangelicals, and especially white evangelicals, if you get into the polling, look at some of the immigration questions, especially around should undocumented immigrants be able to earn citizenship, or especially around dreamers, really, really high levels of support for dreamers to be able to earn citizenship. And at the same time, we've seen the refugee issue become really controversial. And I think obviously that's driven not by a change in our faith, but by a change in some of the political rhetoric. But I think refugees at this point are probably every bit as controversial as undocumented immigrants. If the average American or the average churchgoer could even distinguish between the two, I think there's a lot of conflation between these categories. But that's been something I think we've tried with the new book to focus on refugees alongside the undocumented and help address some of the misconceptions, because unfortunately there are many misconceptions out there right now.
Yeah. So, I remember when we first started working together, probably 7 years ago, there was a much greater effort to separate the idea of immigration and refugee resettlement. And you're right, people conflate the two populations.
When it comes down to it, what we found with some of the politics is not all, but many of the people who would say, well, we're not against immigrations, we're not against immigrants, we're just against illegal immigration. Well, when there's policy solutions to help more people come lawfully to the United States, some of those people ended up opposing those pretty strongly, and even cutting legal migration, cutting legal programs for refugees fleeing persecution to come, which suggests that there's maybe more at the root of some of that opposition for some people than just the legal question of how do people enter the country.
And Jenny, when you're on the Hill talking to members of Congress and their staff, how do you square the circle for them, refugees, documented, undocumented, but then also linking these policy questions to Scripture?
As a policy issue, I think it's pretty distinctive because the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program is run by the Department of State. It's seen as a foreign policy and a humanitarian tool, and it's the president that ultimately makes the decision in terms of the numbers and the State Department, whereas immigration is really seen as a topic that's, Congress makes the laws and there's constant debate about numbers and visas and border security and all of those things that we talk about on a regular basis. And so I think, as you were saying, there has been an attempt to try to separate these two and really deal with each on its own, because I think they each have its own merits and arguments just in terms of why the U.S. should accept more refugees and then why the U.S. should be more welcoming of immigrants. And so I think there's distinctive policy arguments around those questions. But I do think the larger framework is very similar in speaking to American values and speaking to American traditions about welcoming the persecuted and welcoming, the huddled masses and things like that. So I think that larger framework is really helpful to have a broader position on just welcoming immigrants generally.
In the research from the Pew Center, they found that no group agrees less with the idea that the United States has a responsibility to accept refugees than white evangelical Protestants. In essence, the audience that you are trying to speak to.
Yeah, it's, I saw that headline today and that was a little bit discouraging, although not completely surprising, because we've known that while there is a lot of support among some white evangelicals for refugee resettlement, there's also a lot of opposition. And having it quantified like that, I think it is important to make sure we use that qualifier of white evangelicals, because if you survey non-white evangelicals, and that's probably somewhere around a quarter of all evangelical Christians in the US, they tend to be much more positive on both refugee and pretty much every other immigration issue. But among white evangelicals in particular, and that's my category, I think there's a lack of exposure that the more we can do to help people be interacting with refugees, and that's what we do at World Relief. We connect, it's a team from a local church who comes alongside a family as they arrive from Burma or from Congo or from Iraq or from Syria. And their primary job is to be their friends. And we've seen so many churches do that. And those are our best advocates, in addition to the people we keep going back to over and over again to welcome another family. But it's a question of scale, and how do we get that out? I mean, there's millions and millions of white evangelical Christians, and even how you define that term gets complicated. But this is probably based on self-identification. We need to get over the media dynamic, which frankly, a lot of this is, I think, explained by white evangelical Christians watching certain TV channels instead of others and getting a very one-sided perspective on who refugees are. So our goal is to have this be a conversation that's happening in the church, that we're looking at this first and foremost for people who say the Bible is their top authority on everything. Let's make that true around immigration, around refugees. What does the Bible say on this topic? And it says so much. You could do a multi-week series at a church on this topic. And then also addressing some of the most common misconceptions. How are refugees screened? The reality is, I'm not against extreme vetting for refugees. I just think we've already had it for a very long time. It's great that we know who's coming in very carefully. But it's a problem when a lot of Americans have this impression that people are just kind of walking up and entering without any sort of screening. That's never been the case, at least not in any recent history. But I think addressing the misconceptions, addressing the economics is a part of this as well. Almost all economists think refugees and every other category of immigrant are great for the economy. And a lot of Americans don't believe that's true or aren't familiar with that idea. So I think those are the biggest pieces.
And I think when we talk about immigration and refugees, I think a lot of people's attitudes is based on fear. And I think especially as we're trying to change conversations and narrative around the issue of immigration, it's, I think, important to acknowledge people's fears. I think I was in a rural church in Ohio. I had to drive almost 3 hours to get to this really small Mennonite church, literally in Amish country. I was driving there, and there was horse and buggies. There was like an Amish schoolhouse, and very idyllic and beautiful. And I remember the pastor there telling me, there's two things you should know about this congregation as you talk about refugees. First is they all supported Trump, and second is they all watch Fox News. And I was like, oh, this is my perfect audience. And so I gave this 45-minute talk about refugees. And, I think for most of them, they've never heard the way that I talked about this issue from a faith perspective. And then afterwards, a woman came up to me and she just expressed concerns about changing demographics. And I just was kind of just sharing with her personally how I thought about it. And I could just see just how she was changing her heart and her thoughts on this, even as I was talking to her. And she also was someone who grew up having adopted 6 teenagers who were having drug addiction problems. And so she was a very compassionate woman as well. I just don't think she had seen how her faith applies to this very specific issue, nor did she have any relationships with people that were very different than her that would make her think very differently. And so I think it's important to know that not malign people who maybe don't want to be accepting of refugees. I think sometimes it's, there's real animus there, but I think sometimes people are just misinformed, and I think they don't have those relationships. And I think if we malign people's motivations for why they think that way, it doesn't help to build bridges that I think we need to have these really important conversations. And so I think that relationship building is really, really important. At the same time, I think addressing people's misinformation, especially if they're only getting their news from one source, is also very, very helpful. And so, yeah, I think those are all parts of how we can continue to change opinions about this.
And then, Matt, I imagine you've had similar experiences as you've been talking to congregations.
Oh, absolutely. And frankly, that's my favorite event to do. It's where I can see the people with like the frown on their face and their arms crossed and in the fourth pew back, who loosen up as I talk and can talk about, we talk about the Bible for a long time before we really talk about anything on the contemporary immigration stage or anything policy related. And I get to hear people tell me fairly often, this was something totally new to me. I'd never thought about it like this. Sometimes people are still a little bit skeptical. Like, you said that, a lot of undocumented immigrants, or they would probably say illegal immigrants, are paying taxes. Is that really true? And I can point them to 12 different sources for the data on that, including the Social Security Administration themselves, who receive a bunch of the money. But whatever the point is, it just changes people's perspective. And again, I think one of the fundamental misunderstandings is that we don't currently have Ellis Island, that there's a lot of Americans who would be very happy if people would just go sign up for citizenship and don't understand why they don't. And I worked in immigration law as part of my first role at World Relief, so I can explain to them to the best of, try to make simple a very complex set of laws of why that's not possible and why that's actually what we want the laws to change, to make that possible. Not just an automatic citizenship, but a process that people could go through to earn the chance to be a fully integrated citizen of this country. And that's actually what most immigrants want as well. So I think addressing some of those misconceptions is both, it's really rewarding for me personally to see people's minds change and their hearts change as well. And some of those people become the most amazing volunteers, the most amazing people who befriend immigrants in really, remarkable ways.
Which do you think is more important to change, somebody's heart or somebody's mind?
Their heart, for sure. I guess it depends on the person, if you're more cerebral or heart-oriented. But I actually, so for the book, Welcoming the Stranger, I was just reading about messaging and just effective political messaging. How do you change a policy issue when the narrative is so negative? And I cited some research just around the issue of immigration and what has been really effective messaging. And basically their premise was that we can throw facts at people about how immigrants contribute jobs and how they, they're not necessarily a national security threat. They have lower levels of crime than native-born Americans and all of these things. But I think the immigration conversation is really a values question, I think, which gets to the heart. And so I think when people realize, hey, we're giving people an opportunity today that our own families had when they first immigrated here, or a question about who do we really want to be as a country. And for people of faith, what is our faith command of us and how we're supposed to respond to the vulnerable or to the foreign-born in our communities. I actually think those are more important drivers of someone's attitudes and actions than a lot of factual data. And so, I think it's not an either or. I think we have to do both. The issue around immigration is ultimately an issue around identity. It's about whom we value, and what kind of country we want to become. And so I do think that values question is probably the biggest question when it comes to the issue of immigration.
Last request of you, if you will. The name of the podcast is Only in America. So I would ask you to finish this sentence. Only in America, ...
I'll go first because you didn't ask this question on the first time I was on this podcast, Ali, because I think it was like the first time, first or second episode. And then I felt gypped because I didn't get to answer this. A couple of months ago, maybe now, my wife and I were at a marriage conference at our church. And our church is a very diverse church in Aurora, Illinois. And the music was led by a couple from Costa Rica, and the teaching was from a couple from Cuba. And at our table were friends from Honduras and Mexico and Puerto Rico. And, my wife was born in Illinois. I was born in Wisconsin. There's a couple from Venezuela. I think that only happens in America. There's other countries that have traditions of immigration. There are other countries with strong economies that draw people in and with, freedom of speech and that protect human rights. And that's great. But I don't think there's a single country other than the United States that has drawn so many people from so many different places and mixed them all together, and just the vibrancy that gives to this country.
Only in America will you find diehard Eagles fans. No, Ali and I talk all the time about how I love the Philadelphia Eagles, and they finally won a Super Bowl. So I just had to insert that. Similar to Matt's point about just the richness and diversity, I think really only in America will you find just the richness that is our diversity and have that flavor so many aspects of our lives, not just economically and socially, but regarding food and sports and all of these things that we just enjoy.
Jenny Yang and Matt Soerens with World Relief. You just finished and released your second edition of Welcoming the Stranger, Justice, Compassion, and Truth in the Immigration Debate. And the Eagles are ready to defend their Super Bowl championship, of course, right, Jenny? But really, really thank you very much for joining the conversation today. But thank you so much for your partnership. And like I said at the beginning, you're two of my favorite people. And for us as an organization, we just really love working with you. So thank you.
Thank you, Ali.
Thank you, Ali. And thank you for all the great work that you all do at the forum. You're invaluable partners to us.
Jenny and Matt's book, Welcoming the Stranger, Justice, Compassion, and Truth in the Immigration Debate, reflects a changing America. There's more about the book and both Jenny and Matt at immigrationforum.org. That's it for me until next week. The executive producer of Only in America is Kathleen Farrell. The producers are Emily Chow and Regina Medina, with help from the whole team at the National Immigration Forum. I'm Ali Nirani. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next time.